In this video, I'll describe a research project to estimate the effect of standard enforcement of a rear seatbelt law for rear seat fatality prevention in North Carolina. A rear seat standard enforcement law means that vehicles can be stopped for rear seatbelt citations. States without rear seat primary enforcement or standard enforcement laws mean that vehicles can only be given rear seatbelt citations after observing other offenses. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety recently conducted a crash test to evaluate the effects of an unrestrained rear seat occupant on the driver. So we can observe the extreme forces, even at 35 miles per hour, that an unrestrained rear seat occupant has on the driver. For this reason, drivers are twice as likely to be killed with the occupant behind them being unrestrained. In the 5-year period between 2011 and 2015, in North Carolina, there were 327 rear seat passenger fatalities. Of those, 209 were unrestrained, representing 64% of the total rear seat passenger fatalities. Approximately a third of states consider it a primary offense to not wear proper safety restraints in the rear seats. There are several other states, including Florida, Georgia, Kansas, New Jersey, New York, and West Virginia, that only have primary laws passed for those under the age of 18. Among states without standard enforcement, 64% of rear seat fatalities were unrestrained, which is the same as the number for North Carolina, though states that have standard enforcement only see 57% of rear seat fatalities being unrestrained. In that same 5-year time period in North Carolina, 89% of the restrained rear seat occupants survived a fatal crash they were involved in. However, comparing that to rear seat occupants who were in a fatal crash, only 62% of those who were unrestrained survived that fatal crash. Looking at this by age group, 0 to 7-year-olds were represent 26% of the rear seat occupant fatalities were unrestrained, so a relatively small number, only 26% of those 0 to 7 years old, compared to 8 to 15-year-olds, where 64% of rear seat occupant fatalities were unrestrained, and that goes up to 71% for 16 to 17-year-olds being unrestrained, compared to all North Carolina rear seat occupant fatalities. 64% of those were unrestrained. A study by NHTSA found a 14% increase in rear seatbelt use when standard enforcement of rear seatbelt use is in place. For our study, we employed 3 methods to evaluate the effect of standard enforcement. We looked at an optimistic case as our first method, where you would see 100% usage of rear seat belts, while still considering that the forces in some collisions are too violent for even those who are properly restrained to survive. The next method is to compare states with and without standard enforcement, so essentially looking at when a state moves from not having rear seat standard enforcement to having rear seat standard enforcement, and then finally using the NHTSA finding of the 14% increase in rear seatbelt usage. So looking at our most optimistic case, so 100% usage of rear seat belts, although not every life is saved, having 100% seatbelt use would result in 30 lives saved annually. Looking at the state-to-state comparison, again, those that do and do not have standard enforcement for rear seatbelt use, 10 lives saved annually, and then looking at the 14% increase in rear seatbelt use would correspond to 14 lives saved annually. These lives also represent a substantial economic savings, from up to almost $300 million for the 100% seatbelt usage to $100 million for the state-by-state comparison method. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to provide you with additional information. Thanks for your interest in this topic.